Hi everyone. Today we're going to talk about a scenario that I've been asked for quite a bit recently. It's basically you have a workflow that kicks off when an item in SharePoint, a SharePoint list is created. Now, if somebody then goes and modifies that item, they want to be able to start a new instance. So basically terminate the old instance of the workflow and start a new one. Now, where people kind of make the mistake is they try to configure an in-text workflow in the workflow settings for both starting when an item is created and starting when an item is modified and having this sort of yes scenario. That is actually not going to work. The reason being is that in SharePoint, when a workflow is currently running, SharePoint will not start another instance of that workflow. It just won't do it. So what you need to do is actually have like a twofold process. You have this type of workflow, which I've called the onCreated workflow. So this workflow will start when an item in a SharePoint list is created. All this is doing is just assigning a task to somebody. What it's actually doing is really irrelevant in this particular scenario. We only have the assign task action just so that the workflow actually is doing something if another thing happens. Now, this is the first workflow, and all it does is start when an item is created. Then you have a second workflow on the same list. This workflow I've called the onModify workflow. And you look in the start settings, it doesn't start when an item is created, it only starts if an item is modified. Now, because this is a different workflow, so it has a different workflow name, SharePoint will start this workflow instance even though the onCreated workflow is running. So you can have multiple workflows running on the same item as long as they don't have the same name. Now what this workflow does is, because it starts when an item is modified, the first thing we're doing is we have a run if action. The run if is just a conditional action, and we're checking whether the onCreated workflow is currently equal to 2. 2 is basically SharePoint's internal number that represents that the workflow is currently in progress. So if you were to look at this SharePoint list, you'll see here's my onCreated workflow column, and it says in progress. Behind the scenes, that actually has a value of 2, so it'll be in the SharePoint content database. So if this is true and it evaluates that that particular workflow is running, we have an action called the terminate workflow action. And all we're saying here is stop the onCreated workflow. So that's going to terminate that instance. So if this one is sitting on this assign a task action, those people get notified that that task is no longer does not longer need a response, and they'll also get, the initiator will also get an email notification saying that the workflow was cancelled. That's that part. Now, regardless of whether it's running or not, our final step is the start workflow action, and the start workflow action is just starting the onCreated workflow. It's starting it immediately, and just make sure you don't check any of these boxes. So this one is wait for the workflow to complete before continuing. You don't want to do that, because if somebody then goes and edits the item again, you want this workflow to run again and again. Terminate that onCreated workflow and start a new instance. And also, don't do this one, given that actually it doesn't really matter because we've already terminated the workflow, but it says do not start the workflow. If it is already running, it won't be running at this stage when you get to this particular action, so that should be fine anyway. So that's the really easy way of actually getting this to work. It does require you to have 2 separate workflows. One that starts on created, which is basically, think of it as the main workflow that does all your workflow logic, all your business logic. And then you also have your second workflow, which only runs on modified, that actually goes and checks whether the main workflow is running. If it is, terminate. If it isn't, doesn't matter. And finally, start an instance of that main workflow on the current item. So hopefully this helps whoever needs to do this sort of processing. I don't, it's been asked for a lot lately, so hopefully it will help quite a few people. Thanks very much for watching this, and feel free to add any comments, or if you find better ways of doing this or some other scenarios, let me know. Thanks very much.